All right, so today we're going to switch gears. We have been talking about Latin America, but now we're going to go back to France to talk about, was Napoleon an effective ruler of France? And the reason why we wanted to go back to kind of talking about France, is we were talking about how did Latin America manage to create nation states? Were they creating successful nation states? So we also have to see, after the mess of the revolution, the reign of terror, and all these things, was France able to create this democracy that they had fought so hard for? And so basically, what happens is France gets this guy, Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon Bonaparte was a young general who rose to power very quickly within the ranks of the French army. He was from the island of Corsica, which actually wasn't even part of France until a couple years previous to the revolution. It's an island off of Italy. So he was a young general in his early 30s. He managed to conquer a lot of land in Italy for France during the Wars of Revolution. So he's a very popular figure and a very popular general. So when the Directory comes to power and they're ruling France after the Reign of Terror ends, and the Directory was very corrupt and they had a hard time maintaining power and kind of being able to get anything done, the Directory asks Napoleon to come in and stage a coup d'etat to kind of bring order to the government. And so, of course, Napoleon does that. Why wouldn't he? And he creates something called the consulate. And I'll talk about that in a second. So if we look at this picture, though, this picture kind of shows Napoleon was a master at propaganda. He was really good at kind of presenting a public image of himself. He's probably one of the first leaders to really do this. So if we look at this picture, when I do this in class, I always ask, if the sound was turned up on this picture, what would we be hearing? And you would, these guys are all kind of gesturing very wildly. It's probably a very loud, chaotic scene. Everyone's kind of yelling and screaming at each other. And in the center, you have Napoleon. And Napoleon is calm and collected, and he's not taking part of the chaos. And this was kind of the image that Napoleon presents of himself, that he was going to kind of bring calmness and order to France. If we look at this painting here, I know it looks very strange with his very high-waisted pants and his hand stuck in his jacket, but if we look at the clock, it's like 4 a.m. We know it's a.m. and not p.m. because if we look at this little candle there, it's almost completely burned down. And what we see is all his papers scattered on the desk, and it's kind of showing this idea that Napoleon is this man that is going to, work hard for France and stay up and burn the midnight oil to kind of do what's right for France. So in 1799, a new republic, I can't remember what number we're up to now, is declared for France. Napoleon is given the title of consul, and originally there were 3 councils, and the councils had executive authority over the government. Eventually, he makes himself first consul, and then in 1804, he decides to crown himself Emperor of France. Now, if we look at this picture here, we see Napoleon is the guy who's responsible for building the Arc de Triomphe in France in the center of Paris, which goes back to the ideas of Roman times, the triumphal arch, which would be built to commemorate the conquering army coming back from war. And so Napoleon does one of those for his conquering army coming back from war with Europe and conquering all of this land. He makes a lot of allegories to himself and the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. He also tried to make himself seem to be like the champion of the people. So here he is when he's fighting in North Africa, administering and helping out the poor and the sick. He's also a man of the people, hanging out with the little kids. So in 1804, he crowns himself emperor. This is a very famous painting that he commissioned. And we notice that the Pope is here in the background. Here is Napoleon dressed very much like a Roman emperor. And he has a laurel leaf crown on his head, which is what Caesar used to wear. And he is crowning his wife, Josephine, Empress of France. And the story goes that the Pope was about to place the crown on his head, and he takes the crown out of the Pope's hand and places it on his head himself. Now you might ask, well, why is Napoleon hanging out with the church? The French Revolution kind of broke with the church. In 1801, Napoleon made a concordance with the Pope, basically making peace with the church. He acknowledges that Catholicism is the religion of the majority of the people of France. He said that the church can begin again to hold processions and open seminaries to train their priests, that they are no longer an enemy of the government, and that they didn't have to worry about their land being compensated again. But what he did not do is he did not give back the church lands that had been confiscated during the revolution itself. So he makes peace with the church, realizes that most of the people in France are in fact Catholic, but again, he does not redistribute the land that was taken from the upper classes, the first and second estates during the revolution. And he does that because he knows if he starts messing with the land, taking the land away and giving it back to the returning aristocracy, because the Émergés are now returning back to France, that this is going to anger the people, and the result is going to be more war and revolution. So he kind of keeps the land the way it is. One of the major things that he does as emperor is he establishes something called the Napoleonic, sorry, I thought my pen was on, sorry about that, the Napoleonic Code. This is like the main thing he did. So the Napoleonic Code, basically, France had 300 different legal systems. There wasn't one codified or one unified system of laws in France. So he made the same set of laws for the whole country, and he maintained a lot of the principles of the French Revolution: equality before the law, religious toleration, the abolition of serfdom, protecting the property rights. All of those things he maintained. He didn't change those things from the revolution because he knew that those were the things that the people cared about the most in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. He did actually, though, decrease the power of women. Divorce became more difficult for women to get. Women couldn't own property. It was under the control of men. Women were considered minors in lawsuits, considered as children in a lawsuit. Their testimony was less valued in court, and parents had complete rights over their children. But what he does do is create a centralized government with a powerful bureaucracy, promotion being based on ability and talent and not birth, which was another major thing that was fought during the revolution. And we start to see he actually does create an aristocracy, but this aristocracy is based on merit in state service and not by birth. So now if we look at this picture, why was Napoleon unable to make the French Empire last? So in the background of all these things going on in France, we should remember that there's this war that France had originally been fighting with Austria. And remember, that's how Napoleon kind of got his power. So in 1803, this war is going to resume. It's going to be France fighting against Britain. France fighting against Britain, Austria, Russia, and then the Kingdom of Prussia. That's who they're going to be fighting against. Now, France is going to build what they refer to as the Grand Empire. The Grand Empire is going to be a combination of lands that they annex directly, and everything here that's in darker blue, that's all the lands that they annex directly. They're French satellites, which is everything in light blue. Remember, we were talking about Latin American independence. Spain is conquered by France, and Spain is put under the control of Napoleon's brother. So that's why it's in a lighter blue. It's a dependent, it's a satellite state, and it's allies. And so he basically put relatives on the throne of these dependent states. But what he did do, which was actually long-lasting and good for Europe, is he spread the Napoleonic Code to the areas that he conquered, and those things remained even after Napoleon was ultimately defeated. Now, for Napoleon, his arch nemesis was... Sorry, I thought I saw the pen on. His arch nemesis was Britain. He wanted to try to gain control of Britain. But he knew that Britain being a large sea power, invading Britain is not an option. And he knows that because of this battle right here, which is the Battle of Trafalgar. It was a combined naval battle. It was in 1805. It was a combined naval battle. It was the French Navy and the Spanish Navy combined. And they basically got their butts kicked by the British Navy. And it really kind of showed Napoleon, all right, invading Britain is not going to be an option because they're this major sea power, and the only way you can invade Britain is by sea. So in 1806, he instituted something called the Continental System. So he figured if he can't attack Great Britain, he can attack Great Britain with its economy. So he placed an embargo on Great Britain. Figured he could destroy the economy this way. So he said, all of the parts of the French Empire, all of the French satellites, all of the French allies, no one can trade with Great Britain. So he basically cut off all of Europe from trading with Great Britain. Now, the problem with this, though, which is very simple, is that Britain at this point is the only country in Europe that's industrialized. So most of those countries in Europe that were being told by Napoleon they could not trade with Great Britain wanted to be able to trade with Great Britain because they had all of the manufactured goods that they didn't make themselves. So a huge smuggling ring was going on, even between France and Britain, where goods were being smuggled back and forth across the English Channel. Also, Britain had trade contacts, as we were just talking about in the other video, with South America. They had trade contacts with North America. They had trade contacts in Asia. So Britain was kind of like, fine, we don't need to trade with you, Europe. We can trade with everyone else in the world. And so Britain really wasn't affected by the Continental System, but the European countries were affected by the Continental System. Now, the other major thing that begins to develop during this time period is a rise of nationalism. So Napoleon comes in, he takes over a part of Europe. And basically he doesn't want to overtax his own French people back at home. So he drains money out of the countries he conquers. So he's taking all of this money, he's charging very high taxes on his dependent kingdoms. In addition, he is drafting them into the army. So now you have a bunch of people fighting who are like, why the heck am I fighting for France to take over more land so that they can just drain more of our money? And so there wasn't a lot of incentive amongst those people to fight. The other issue is nationalism, like I said before. Nationalism really, really helped the French in the beginning of this war, because they were fighting for a cause. They were fighting to not have the king brought back. They were fighting for the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And it really helped to kind of encourage the people to fight on. Now, what happens as the years go on, and now France is this major power, is nationalism is going to come back to bite France in the butt. Because now the Spanish are like, well, we don't want to be ruled by the French because we're Spanish. And the Germans are like, well, we don't want to be ruled by the French because we're German. And this painting here by Goya, it's called the 12th of May, really kind of exemplifies this. So we see here this man standing here on his, actually he's on his knees, dressed all, in white, with his hands up, almost like Christ on the cross, with the light kind of shining down on him and his white shirt almost glowing. These poor people who have been shot previously, who are now drowning in their own blood, all these people around him crying. So you see the emotions on these people's faces and the fear that they have, the monk here kind of praying over the people who have been shot. And in contrast, you have the French firing squad, and they're completely, dehumanized. You only see the backs of their heads and their guns about to shoot these unarmed, poor-looking peasants. And so this painting here really helped to kind of exemplify the nationalism that was growing in response to French imperialism across the continent of Europe. And that's why eventually France is going to be defeated. And the final question is, why was France defeated? So France made the really bad mistake of deciding to invade Russia. So Russia was refusing to follow the Continental System, and they were still trading with Britain. So in June of 1812, the French decided to invade Russia. They had an army of 600,000 people. It was called the Grand Army. They left from Warsaw, Poland, and they went to go in and attack Russia. Now, the Russians have something that they call the Scorched Earth policy. So what the Russians do is, rather than engaging the French army head on, they kind of retreat and they draw back, fall back. And what they do is they force the French army then to follow them. And they draw the French army deeper and deeper and deeper into Russia. Now, as the French army retreats, they burn everything. They burn houses, they burn crops, they burn everything. That's why it's called the Scorched Earth. And what that does is it increases the supply lines of the invading army, and it doesn't give the invading army any place to get any food or shelter, because usually when an army invades, they will get their money or they'll get their supplies from the land of the area that they've conquered. So by October of 1812, the French army has made it all the way into Moscow, and they figured, all right, we'll winter in Moscow, and then we'll continue the fighting again. Well, the Russians burn Moscow. So the French army makes it into Moscow. There's no place for them to stay. They are forced to retreat in what is known as the Grand Retreat. and only 40,000 people made it back to Poland. This was basically like the turning point of the war. This wasn't the end of the war to defeat Napoleon, but this was the turning point because it was shown like how bad Napoleon could be, how easily Napoleon could be defeated. This led to what was called the War of Liberation. And by April of 1814, Napoleon had been defeated, and he was exiled to the island of the island of Elba. Elba is an island off the coast of Italy. So here you can see this image of, the British up there, the lightning bolt, killing the Medusa, the evil French with the guillotine and all the craziness that the French were doing. So he's exiled off to the island of Elba. He is made into the emperor of Elba, actually, but he can't leave the island. And the monarchy is restored to the throne. Louis XVIII is brought out of exile and put back on the throne of France. Now, what's kind of crazy is that Napoleon decides he doesn't want to stay on the island of Elba, and so he escapes off the island of Elba. He gets into France, and the French people, in a huge number, flock to Napoleon. Napoleon is able to raise another army of about 100,000 men, and he fights on again for what's known as Napoleon's 100 Days. The armies have to be re-raised to defeat him, and ultimately he is defeated at the Battle of Waterloo on June 18th, 1815. And it is a combined force of the British and the Prussians, and ultimately Napoleon was defeated. And at that point he was exiled off to the island of St. Helena, which is an island in the South Atlantic off the coast of Africa, where he there dies of natural causes. So now, why did they do that rather than just execute him? Obviously, the French people had a very strong following for Napoleon, and they figured if they executed him, he would become a martyr. So let's just set him on an island, and hopefully he will just die in obscurity. So if we look at this picture here, it kind of shows the progression of Napoleon as he goes up through the ranks. Here he is as general, here he is as emperor, fighting on a sled in Russia, being defeated, and now he's burning in hell, was how the Europeans viewed him. So I want you to think about, was Napoleon actually an effective ruler? We're going to do some readings about Napoleon in class. For now, that's all I got for France. See you in class. Talk to you later.